This is Robert Gates, and we need to strip away the diplomatic varnish to confront a significant failure in how we are conducting our national security and legal affairs regarding Venezuela. What we are witnessing with the Department of Justice's quiet retreat from the claim that the Cartel de los Soles is an actual organization is not merely a clerical correction in a legal filing, but a glaring symptom of a much deeper pathology where political narratives are allowed to override intelligence assessments and facts on the ground. For years, particularly starting with the Trump administration's initial push in 2020, Washington has operated under the convenient fiction that Nicolás Maduro was the godfather of a structured, hierarchical drug cartel, a narrative that made for excellent press releases and justified aggressive sanctions, but ultimately lacked the evidentiary bedrock necessary for a viable criminal prosecution in a federal court. The cold, hard truth is that we allowed desire to masquerade as data, constructing a strategy of maximum pressure on a foundation of sand. And now that the rubber has met the road with Maduro in custody, the prosecutors are forced to dismantle the very mythology that the politicians spent years building. We must look at the specific chronology of this embarrassment to understand the severity of the disconnect between our rhetoric and reality. As recently as July of 2025, the Treasury Department, copying language from a flawed previous indictment, designated the Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization. And Marco Rubio, acting as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, ordered the State Department to follow suit in November. Yet, experts in Latin American organized crime have been telling us for decades that this cartel does not exist in the traditional sense. Rather, it is a slang term invented by Venezuelan media in the 90s to describe a loose network of corrupt officials. The revised indictment released this past Saturday tacitly concedes this point by abandoning the claim that it is a formal organization, instead accurately describing it as a patronage system and a culture of corruption where drug money buys loyalty within the military ranks. This retreat calls into question the legitimacy of our recent terrorist designations for while you can designate a phantom entity by executive fiat, you cannot convict a defendant of leading a group that you cannot prove exists to a jury in the Southern District of New York. The situation reveals a dangerous lack of strategic coordination that borders on incoherence when we observe the contradictory messaging coming from the highest levels of our government. While the Justice Department was busy scrubbing the indictment to reflect reality, Marco Rubio went on national television the very next day to insist that the Cartel de los Soles is a transnational criminal organization and that Maduro is its leader. This creates a chaotic operational environment where our top diplomat is threatening military strikes against a specific entity that our federal prosecutors have essentially admitted is a colloquialism for systemic corruption. Furthermore, this narrative was never supported by the Drug Enforcement Administration's annual threat assessments or the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, neither of which ever recognized this so-called cartel as a major trafficking organization. When we ignore our own professional intelligence assessments in favor of politically expedient storylines, we not only damage our credibility with allies who know the terrain better than we do, but we also hand our adversaries a propaganda victory by demonstrating that our judicial processes can be manipulated by executive whims. We are also seeing a troubling persistence of this kitchen sink approach to prosecution in other aspects of the revised indictment, specifically the attempt to link Maduro to the Trinidad prison gang. The new indictment names the leader of this gang as a co-conspirator based on remarkably thin evidence, specifically a phone call from 2019 where the gang leader offered protection services to someone he believed was an official This contradicts the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community, which believes that Maduro and this gang are actually at odds, and independent analysis suggests the gang does not even own major cocaine shipments. By trying to forcefully merge every bad actor in Venezuela into a single unified conspiracy led by Maduro, we are repeating the exact same mistake we made with the cartel designation, which is prioritizing the optical impact of the charges over their factual sustainability. It is also worth noting that the architect of the original flawed 2020 indictment, Emil Bove III, recently ran the Justice Department during a turbulent transition period before being appointed to a lifetime federal judgeship, a sequence of events that suggests we are rewarding those who prioritize political loyalty over prosecutorial rigor. The pragmatic prescription here is for the administration to immediately align its public posture with the legal realities outlined in the new indictment. We must stop chasing ghosts and focus on the very real, very provable patronage system of corruption that the Department of Justice has finally accurately identified. There is no need to invent a cartel to prosecute a dictator who has systematically looted his country and facilitated trafficking. The truth of his corruption is damning enough without the embellishment. We need to stop using the terrorist designation process as a tool for political signaling and return it to its intended purpose of identifying actual operational threats based on solid intelligence. If we want to dismantle the criminal networks in Venezuela, we must operate with surgical precision based on how they actually function, not how we wish they functioned. Continuing to wage war against a slang term while the real networks adapt and evolve is a dereliction of duty that wastes American resources and ultimately fails the people of Venezuela, who are looking to us for competent leadership, not just rhetorical bluster. Returning to the podium, because we have only scratched the surface of this intelligence failure, and to leave the briefing at a high-level summary would be a disservice to the gravity of the situation. We need to conduct a deep dive autopsy into how the Department of Justice, the State Department, and the White House allowed a fictional narrative to hijack American foreign policy toward Venezuela for nearly half a decade. The fact that prosecutors have now abandoned the claim that the Cartel de las Solas is an actual organization is not just a legal pivot. It is a devastating indictment of the decision-making process within the Trump administration and its successors. We are looking at a systemic breakdown where political appointees driven by the desire for headlines and maximum pressure campaigns overruled the nuanced ground-level assessments of career intelligence officers and regional experts. When we see that the original 2020 indictment referred to this phantom cartel 32 times and described Maduro as its supreme leader, while the new indictment mentions it only twice as a loose reference to a patronage system, we are witnessing the collapse of a house of cards that should never have been built in the first place. Let us dissect the origin of this myth, because it is a textbook example of confirmation bias gone wrong in the intelligence cycle. Experts in Latin American crime have known since the 1990s that Cartel of the Suns was merely a derogatory slang term coined by Venezuelan journalists to mock generals who wore sun insignias on their epaulets and were lining their pockets with drug money. It was a description of a phenomenon, not a corporate entity, yet Washington treated it as if it were the Cali cartel or the Sinaloa cartel with a flowchart and a CEO. The Drug Enforcement Administration, in its annual National Drug Threat Assessment, never listed this group as a major trafficking organization, nor did the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in its World Drug Report. These are the gold standard documents for counter-narcotics intelligence, and their silence on the matter should have been a deafening alarm bell to the White House. Instead, policymakers chose to ignore the experts and embraced a convenient fabrication because it was easier to sell the American public on the idea of a narco-terrorist kingpin than to explain the complex, messy reality of a decentralized, state-sponsored corruption network that requires a far more sophisticated diplomatic and economic response than simply putting a bounty on a president's head. The level of bureaucratic schizophrenia we are currently witnessing between our diplomatic and judicial arms is frankly dangerous for our national security standing. In July of 2025, the Treasury Department designated this non existent group as a terrorist organization. And in November, Marco Rubio doubled down by ordering the State Department to do the same. This was a coordinated effort to box Maduro in, but it was built on a legal lie that has now unraveled in the Southern District of New York. When Elizabeth Dickinson from the International Crisis Group states that designations do not have to be proved in court and that the administration clearly knew they could not prove the existence of the cartel, she is highlighting a cynical manipulation of state power. We are essentially using the terrorist designation label, a tool designed to stop groups like Al Qaeda, as a political sticker to slap on adversaries we dislike, regardless of whether they fit the statutory definition. This cheapens the designation, erodes the credibility of the Treasury's sanctions regime, and signals to the world that American justice is fluid and subject to the whims of the political calendar rather than the rigid standards of evidence. We must also confront the troubling personnel dynamics that allowed this fiction to metastasize into official policy. The drafting of the flawed 2020 indictment was oversaw by Emil Bove III, a prosecutor who later ascended to run the Justice Department during the chaotic opening months of the second Trump administration. His tenure was marked not by a rigorous adherence to the rule of law, but by turbulence, the firing of dozens of officials, and the controversial dismissal of bribery charges against the mayor of New York. That this individual was subsequently appointed by President Trump to a lifetime position on a federal appeals court sends a chilling message to the rank and file workforce of the Justice Department. It suggests that the path to promotion is not through meticulous, fact-based prosecution, but through the willingness to draft politically expedient narratives that collapse under scrutiny years later. We are incentivizing the politicization of intelligence and law enforcement, creating a culture where ambitious prosecutors are encouraged to stretch the truth to please their political masters, leaving the cleanup crew to deal with the humiliating retractions when the cases finally reach a courtroom. The revised indictments attempt to pivot from the cartel narrative to a new conspiracy involving the Tren de Aragua prison gang is another example of this desperate grasping for a narrative hook. Prosecutors have added the head of this gang as a co-conspirator, alleging a link based on a single phone call from 2019 where the gang leader offered protection services to someone he thought was a Venezuelan official. This is remarkably thin gruel for a federal conspiracy charge involving a head of state. It flies in the face of assessments by the U.S. Intelligence community, which believes that Maduro and the Tren de Aragua are actually adversaries, not allies. Jeremy McDermott of Insight Crime has correctly pointed out that this inclusion reflects President Trump's rhetoric more than it reflects the reality of the criminal underworld, noting that the gang does not even have ownership of major cocaine shipments. By trying to force a square peg into a round hole, we are once again prioritizing the political narrative that Maduro is the puppet master of all evil in the region over the complex reality of fragmented criminal power dynamics, risking another embarrassing legal collapse in the future. The distinction between a cartel and a patronage system is not merely semantic, it is fundamental to how we design our strategy to combat the regime. A cartel has a head that can be cut off, leading to the group's disruption, which was the logic behind the decapitation strategy of indicting Maduro. A patronage system, however, is a pervasive culture of corruption where drug profits flow to rank and file military and intelligence officials to buy their loyalty to the state. As the new indictment finally admits, Maduro's role was to participate in, perpetuate, and protect this system, just as Hugo Chavez did before him. This means that simply removing Maduro does not automatically destroy the cartel of the Suns, because the cartel is actually the military institution itself, corrupted by illicit finance. Understanding this distinction requires a complete overhaul of our sanctions and diplomatic strategy, moving away from the simplistic manhunt approach toward a more comprehensive effort to fracture the military's loyalty and offer off ramps for officials who are trapped in this cycle of graft. We spent 5 years fighting a phantom organization, wasting precious time and leverage when we should have been dismantling the financial plumbing of the patronage network that actually keeps the regime afloat. Ultimately, this episode must serve as a stark warning about the dangers of policy-based evidence making, where the conclusion is decided first that Maduro is a cartel boss and the intelligence is cherry-picked or fabricated to support it. The Justice Department's retreat is a necessary corrective, but the damage to our reputation is already done. Marco Rubio's continued insistence on NBC's Meet the Press that the cartel exists and that the U.S. reserves the right to strike its boats is a display of cognitive dissonance that would be comical if it were not involving nuclear-armed powers and the stability of the Western Hemisphere. We cannot conduct foreign policy in a parallel universe where we pretend our own legal filings haven't debunked our talking points. To restore American credibility, we must return to a cold, hard realism that accepts the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, for a campaign slogan, and that begins with acknowledging that we were wrong about the Cartel de los Soles and pivoting to a strategy based on the undeniable, proven corruption that actually exists.